So I hope that you all learned a lot in cyber right now. I particularly learned a lot about testing in dogs and rubber duckies and vulnerabilities and Internet of Things like that. But our next talk will be Limor Kessem. Limor is one of the top cyber intelligence experts at IBM Security. She's a seasoned security advocate, public speaker, and a regular blogger on the cutting-edge IBM Security Intelligence blog. Limor comes to IBM from organizations like RSA Security, where she spent 5 years as part of the RSA Research Labs and drove the fraud action blog on RSA Speaking of Security. She also served as the marketing director of big data analytics startup TethArray, where she created the company's cybersecurity thought leadership. Limor tweets security items as iCyberfighter and is an avid Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter. So, Limor, before we start, we need to give you some whiskey.
No, it's okay. Yeah, it's that. Is it working? Everybody can hear me? I could actually stand closer to the screen. So hi everyone, I'm Limor Kessem. I'm a person who wakes up every day in order to go and see what cyber criminals are doing. That's my biggest passion. It's a very unhealthy passion. It can keep you up long hours of the night and you can find yourself doing really strange things. So in order to feed this passion, I decided to go work for IBM Security, where I work in the cybercrime labs. And there are dozens of researchers I work with who help me feed my addiction, so they kind of make it worse, but at the end of the day, we all have a really good time. So in the past 7 years or so, I've been concentrating a lot on financial cybercrime, so everything from online fraud methods and things that criminals do, from the lowest end of criminals all the way up to organized cybercrime. So today in my presentation, I want to bring you a little bit into my world. How many people here do financial cybercrime? Yeah. So work on financial cybercrime. So there are people here that I know and that I worked with in the past or work with in the present, but I see that most of you are not in that field, so I hope this is going to be interesting for you. It's not a very deeply technical talk, so you guys have been super brave until now with the super technical talks at this time of day. And so we'll start without further ado. Wait, let's see here. Okay, I'll just do it like this. So as I was saying, my job is to stalk cybercrime. Part of my habits is reading configuration files, which are what malware uses in order to know what to do, who to attack, and how to attack them. And that kind of tells the story of what cybercriminals are doing, what they're going to do, and who they're going to do it to. So that's part of how we do research and investigation of that kind of stuff. Oh, wonderful. Sorry. Good? Yeah, that's good. Seems good. This is what we're going to look at today in the slides. We're going to talk a little bit about the malware beasts that have emerged in the past couple of years specifically. Like malware, financial malware has existed for many years now. The real bigger organized cybercrime has not been around for as long, obviously. So we're going to talk about them a little bit and about their method called a redirection attack. This is the theme of today's presentation. So organized crime is actually just a natural evolution of crime. Just like the internet came and changed the way we live our lives today and we do everything with the internet, it has also changed in a very natural way the way crime moved into the cyber world. And there are two major ways that it moved in terms of organization. There are the homegrown organized crime from people who were developers and black hat developers and just turned to the evil side. And there are actual mafia bosses who decided to diversify their portfolio and saw value in starting to do financial cybercrime, bringing in people to help them out, but they're still just mafia lords. So this is the sort of stuff that keeps me the most interested, and I wanted to talk to you about. And this is just a little image showing you that the mobsters of yesterday are today a different type of mobster, more on the digital side. So what kind of differentiates this type of cybercrime? There is a lot of skill there. An organized crime is not, just a lone hacker or a couple of guys doing some tricky stuff on the internet. There's very advanced skills, exploit research, security researchers. They have resources, so they're getting paid good money to do what they're doing, and they're being protected by the crime lords they work for. They're very stealthy. They have very good operational security. Sometimes, some cases, polices and international law enforcement will try to take them down unsuccessfully because they know what they're doing. They know how to hide themselves. They know how to come back sometimes from disastrous things that, that police tries to inflict on them. They're very organized, and as a result of these attributes, they can constantly innovate. The malware that we work on, stuff like Dridex, GozNym, NeverQuest, we see changes in those malwares almost every day. We see new builds every week. We see things always evolving in sometimes very ingenious ways, sometimes more basic stuff, but we do definitely see interesting things happening all the time. So I'm going to continue to talking a little bit about the malware that is involved in this type of cybercrime. Most of the codes that we're talking about today have emerged somewhere in mid-2014. So we would be mentioning Trojans like the Dire Trojan. It's been a little dead for a while. There's the Dridex Trojan. Those two both emerged around the same time in mid-2014. And a new iteration of something called the GozNym Trojan that just turned into a hybrid in just a couple months ago in April, and turned into a banking Trojan that's really gaining a lot of speed. And I submitted for this talk a couple months ago when Karen and the team were organizing it. And I wanted to talk about the redirection attacks, and I didn't know that it was just going to get all that much hotter with time. And today I'm actually releasing another blog about it, so later on this evening. So emerged starting 2014, so it's a rather recent type of development, leveraging parts of existing code. So these malwares did not just pop out of nowhere for the most part. They relied partly or entirely on previous codes that existed. They have a very skilled in-house research or development team that constantly makes the malware get better, get stealthier, be able to do more things, be able to manipulate the browser in better ways. Their end goal is just to always be a little bit ahead of security so they're still able to make enough money to make it worth their while. So constant evolution, as I mentioned. They've been diversifying their target list. If we looked at financial cybercrimes 5 years ago, most of the time they would target people like you and I, where if we had money in our bank account, they would just rob that money out of the bank account. There were some gangs that were doing some business account, but nowadays the major cybercrime gangs are looking for corporate money, and they're looking to also diversify to things like pension monies that are in different countries coming into the bank account. In other words, people can actually transfer money from their pension into their checking account, which is what cybercriminals are looking at. So they're looking at a whole bunch of different things that they didn't look at before. Of course, in terms of business account, they're looking for corporate, treasury, investment, anything that can make them more money than the usual, high-value individuals, professionals, etc. And so with this aim that they have on corporate money, they do not settle anymore to just rob a few tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. They want to start at a few million, and they want to go all the way up to robbing $1 billion at a time. And we're going to get to that towards the end of the presentation, and you'll see a case like that. How these organized crime groups have been facilitating these things that they've been doing is by throwing into the mix something called a redirection attack. And we don't see redirection attacks happening for all the malware out there. Not all the financial malware is able to do it. The two groups that are doing it right now are the Dridex team. This is a very well-established cybercrime gang, and a gang that's running something called GozNym, which is a hybrid of the NyMem downloader into which they embedded a GozNym Trojan financial module. So they're the only two. This whole thing kind of surfaced with the Dire Trojan, but Dire has been gone for a bit. However, the concept remains and keeps them successful. How they do a redirection is they wait for somebody like you and I, or like an accountant or somebody in a company, to try to log into a bank account. And the minute they try to get to their bank account, they take them away from there. They make sure they don't land on the bank's website, and then they just start showing them on what we would call a phishing page of sort, start showing them different things to make them give credentials, give them the login and password, and then keep them waiting. And then if they need more information, they'll just throw web injections into that session and ask them, give me your token code or whatever. In some cases, the attackers support this, and when they attack really big money and they need more than one token code or they need more information, they would support this with a phone call and social engineering that's more elaborate. But the user on their end is not seeing anything wrong. The criminals have been able to implement this so well that when you're on a fake website, you think you're on the real website because it looks perfectly real. They are managed to actually keep a session alive in order to pull the genuine bank's SSL certificate to a fake site. You see the right URL in the window. So this is just an example. It could be any bank, obviously. So you would see the favicon on top, you would see the correct URL, and you'll even see the right certificate. So on the user side, they're just not able to detect this or see that anything is wrong with this. And on the bank server side, it's even worse because they're not on the bank site. So the bank cannot see them or protect them, which effectively cuts off the victim from the security that their bank would typically give them. And we've seen through the years criminals find ways to bypass security, find ways to block it, or get around it, change their flow of events. But here, this is really a game changer in that sense that they're just taking the victim away completely. So if we're looking at just a general schematic of how this works, the victim's device is obviously infected with malware from that moment on, as they are an infected victim. Anytime they browse to that bank's website or to banks that interest the malware, they're never going to see the original website anymore. They're always going to see what the malware is commanded to show them. So they're going to be either redirected or they're going to see a completely different screen that's brought in by a special web injection called a full page replacement. So the malware can actually just replace the bank's page entirely. And on that site, two things can happen. Either the malware is going to do web injections, which is inject extra fields into the actual page, or it can just change text on it because the criminal controls that page. So it could throw HTML at them, and that's just good enough. Once the criminal has all the details they need, they're able to start a banking session. So using somebody's login, username, credentials, etc., on a different computer, they just start a money transfer. And if they have all the details, it's going to succeed. So keeping all these extra websites to mimic banks' websites is a lot of work for cybercrime gangs. Because they have to actually decide, okay, who do we want to attack, how do they operate, and plan that attack, and then they have to create something that looks like that website. Typically, that's a lot of work for them to maintain, and they don't do it on a long list of banks. For the most part, they will choose a certain geography where they're going to do it, usually a geography where they run into a lot of security on the bank side. So the UK, the US for that matter. They could test it out in different parts of the world, like they've done. GozNym tested it out in Poland. And they bother doing it because it gives them a few benefits. First of all, they take the victim away to somewhere where they're completely unsafe. The bank cannot protect them. The bank cannot even know they're starting a session. They're not starting a session. They are also avoiding entirely injecting code into the bank's website, like other malware does and like they've been doing for many, many years. Why? Because obviously banks have gotten solutions to help them detect when injections are interfering with the sessions or when things are being thrown in by malware. So they're avoiding that altogether. They're keeping their configuration files pretty clean. In other words, things could be pulled directly from the server in real time, and then security researchers looking at the configuration file of the malware are not necessarily going to see what it's going to do, what is it telling the victim, how can this all be mitigated on the bank side, so they're keeping that part concealed. And they're keeping the flow of events of how the attack happens under wraps, because for most security researchers that work for vendors that help the bank, they would need to have actual user credentials and be able to mimic the user completely in order to understand the attack. So that's another benefit for them, is keeping it under wraps for a longer time. Obviously, they can't do it forever, but it's helping them. And so this facilitates their ability to just keep getting money out of bank accounts and out of business accounts. When Dyer started doing this in 2014, it helped Dyer become the top attacking malware in the world by 2015. So before it was even a year old, it was already the top attacking malware that surpassed all other cybercrime gangs and other Trojans that were out there being operated by just anybody who could compile a Zeus Trojan, for example. So Dyer went on and focused very much on business banking, on investment, online trading, everything that would have bigger money. They implemented the redirection attacks on that sort of configuration, and they went to work on it. In cases that we looked into throughout 2015, we would see Dyer used against companies and just looking for really big money. Last year, in around April, IBM Security was able to uncover this campaign where the Trojan was being used to harvest millions of dollars out of bank accounts, which is what started a whole trend in the world of cybercrime, because after this started, then Dridex followed it, and now GozNym is following it as well. So here is a Dridex obfuscated configuration, also very focused on business and corporate. There's still some retail banking, because there are more people in those gangs probably doing some retail banking fraud as well, but very focused on the big accounts. And if we look at GozNym, which is a relatively new type of hybrid, we also see a very strong focus on business banking. Let's see how Dridex got into starting to do these redirection attacks, these very, call them beneficial type of attacks for the criminals that help them bypass a lot of security all at once. So they actually figured this out probably because there were some people who were working with the Dyer project, and after Dyer got busted, some of them may have moved over to the Dridex team, and some rumors in the security industry say that this was part of the case. They started scheming this somewhere in late 2015. We on our end started seeing it in the configurations of the Dridex Trojan. We saw that it has added a new element. So the Dridex configuration is made of elements, and we saw a new one come into the game. We saw a new configuration show up a week later with something called a switch-off toggle. We still didn't know what it is until we saw 1st of January, the first functional redirection configuration, where they literally had all the code in, and they were able to start redirecting users, not allowing them to get to their true bank's website. We talked about this a little bit in the media in order to alert banks, and of course, before we ever blog about stuff like that, you can imagine we disclose it and give the banks all the information, and then we talk about it and let all the community know as well. So if we look at a non-infected web session basics, we have this session taking place where there's a request sent to the bank server processes it, returns it, and that goes to the user's interface, and that's a pretty straightforward, clean request, the way things are supposed to happen. If we look at the basics of a Dridex redirection, this actually has some sort of a man in the middle that's also receiving the request. So once the user generates a request to go to bank123.com, that request is first sent to the criminal. The criminal first looks at it, may make some changes to it, returns it, but once it comes back, they're actually sending a clean original request to the bank in order for the bank server to return all the different elements that the criminal wants to eventually use in the response to the victim. However, even though they return that request, it is altered and the victim never sees the true request from the bank come back, but they do see the important elements. They're going to see the right SSL, they're files that don't exist on the bank's website at all. And those are the kind of elements that exist on the fake replica. And so banks would see that. They would be able to say, yeah, we know there is this Dridex activity on our website. We know that's going on because we see these weird requests coming in and they make no sense. So in that sense, they have some sort of protection, but it's not a very reliable thing. When these things are already implemented, what the gang would typically do is test it out. In some cases, where they know how the bank system works, they don't need to do it. In other cases, they might try to do a click shot configuration where they follow the flow of events of when every time the victim clicks the left click with their mouse, it's going to take a screen capture, and eventually they're going to have a series of it. Other Trojans just film like a video of the desktop and look at what the victim is doing. Once they have done that, they might decide already which websites to redirect. So not all websites are going to get redirected just because they can. They're not going to make that kind of investment, and they're not going to do it on each and every bank, and they're not even going to do it all the time on the same bank. These things are very dependent on stuff that the criminals decide on their end, and they're very careful and experienced in what they would use it for. So let's see what Dridex has been up to with this kind of stuff for the past, let's say since last October. There's a lot of things that Dridex has been doing. First of all, stealing millions of dollars from companies, so it's been successful doing that. Clearly, it has garnered a lot of attention from law enforcement, and although the FBI had announced that they arrested people and they disabled the malware, it couldn't be farther from the truth. They were not able to do it, and the Dridex team managed to come back from that very easily and very quickly. Actually, never went away. In more recent news, if we fast forward to this month, we see another thing that's been happening with Dridex a lot. It's just they seem to be quiet for a little while, and then they upgrade the malware and they continue their activity. They've done that recently as well. We've seen them go a little quiet. That's something people are asking why they're going quiet. Were they scared to get arrested? There were some arrests in Russia. Are they in Russia? People are speculating about what's going on. But in reality, what's really going on is that they don't need to be very noisy. They've been doing a lot bigger things, and what has come to be more public now is that the Dridex malware and perhaps the gang that operates it have been implicated in heists like the Bangladesh bank heist. So we know that in that heist there was an attempted transfer of nearly $1 billion. They've transferred, a couple of transfers that amounted to $81 million, and then they tried a $951 million transfer as well. That only got stopped, by the way, because of a typo in the word foundation that Deutsche Bank then realized happened, and then they had called in and started asking questions. Other than that, it would probably have worked, which is a scary and freaky thing. And then after all this happened, obviously there were, I don't know if you've heard about it, but there are at least 20 other banks that have come up and turned to security vendors to know more about because they have similar issues as well. So these gangs that have been doing, consumer bank fraud maybe in 2014 or in 2016 doing a lot bigger things and attacking the corporate money, not only from corporations, but from the bank as a corporation. So what's a gang like Dridex worth today? There are all kinds of estimates. I put this image here on the screen just in comparison. If we take something like CryptoWall, which is ransomware, it's not considered as advanced or as modular or as sophisticated as Dridex by any extent. But it's also a part of what organized crime has been doing. And if they reportedly made almost $325 million last year, and they're probably going to make $500 million this year, how much is Dridex worth? What did they do? What's the damage they're inflicting on the economy? So the FBI was talking about $10 million. I don't think it's about $10 million. Then the NCA in the UK was saying 31 million. Global losses say 100 million. But nowadays, when we know the extent of what they've been doing and the sort of money they've been trying to rob from banks in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, we know that a gang like this is worth way more than $1 billion, obviously. And they've been around for a little while. They've not started today making this money. So organized crime is definitely what's causing cybercrime overall to become an important issue to economies all over the world, to polices all over the world. If we look at the estimated damages of this type of crime, we're looking at about $445 billion of money that just becomes what's called a transfer of wealth. So taken from Western countries into other countries that would never have this money. and the resources that are lost in those countries, somewhere we have to understand that it's affecting everything in the economy. Now let's talk a little bit about GozNym. This is going to be shorter. So GozNym is a hybrid that was discovered by IBM researchers in April. Basically, the GozNym Trojan, that's a downloader that has existed since at least 2013. A downloaded Trojan just comes into a computer and then calls in another malware. GozNym has been typically calling in a ransomware. All kinds of ransomware. It dabbled a little bit in other financial malware, but very little. Essentially, it was a downloader that brings in ransomware into computers, and that's what it was most known for. So in the latter part of 2015, it started bringing in a GozNym module. So GozNym is a banking Trojan. It started wanting to rob banks, so they kind of diversified from their ransomware roots and started wanting to steal bigger money. So started bringing in the GozNym and deploying that. GozNym is actually a leaked code, so they're probably able to get it from one of the people they know or from an underground venue or somewhere where they have access to. And the next thing you know, they were making money with that, and that was working well. So they probably had their developer kind of take those two and mumble-jumble them together and just embed the GozNym into the GozNym and say, hey, let's just bring it in as one malware, and now they've had this GozNym thing that comes into a computer and is a full-on banking Trojan with a very effective injection methodology and the way that the GozNym Trojan has been doing things forever. And this has been making tons of money for these guys, and to be more exact, about $4 million in the first couple of days it emerged. Because the minute it hit, nobody expected, nobody knew what it was at first, and even though there were alerts about this issue, it still went through because it was very similar to attacks that they thought they knew, and so it took a little while to stop. GozNym surprised everybody when very little time after it emerged, it was able to implement the redirection attacks. At which point we realized that we're probably dealing with a sophisticated enough team, something that, or someone that probably came into the GozNym gang that had the GozNym code, obviously, because it's not a public code, and started pushing this forward and started making this into a cybercrime operation. The implementation of the same concept for GozNym is a little different. It's also implemented a lot through the configuration. It's not as sophisticated per se, it's just interesting in a sense. So as soon as a user tries to browse to their bank's website, a page replica is pulled from the criminal's server, so they have two servers for this working at the same time. The next thing that happens is a really weird and clunky thing where just a white page is pulled over that fake, malicious page. It could be just so that security researchers are not right away going to see it, but I mean, the source code of the page is still there, so it's kind of silly. It's delivered to the victim's computer, and then only when the second server sends the JavaScript does it ever get lifted, and then the user sees the actual malicious content and is being manipulated into giving their credentials, etc. So this has been just a funny implementation of that, but it's working for them and they've been doing it. Another thing we've been seeing them doing in the past few days is simply changing the HTML code in the most primitive and ugly way. The point of just throwing in scripts, external scripts into the page that they control anyway, and just even throwing a full HTML page on it and in a very quick and dirty way, because they don't even need to do injections. It's their page. It just makes things a lot easier for them. So I'm going to recap this session with what I started saying in the beginning. So organized cybercrime has found a new way to bypass security. They found a way to make things easier for themselves and to be able to rob millions of dollars from bank accounts. They're very focused on business accounts. They want to make as much money as they can in as little time as possible. This endeavor is costly for them. It costs them in resources. It apparently costs them in maintaining this. They don't spread it all over the spectrum and do all kinds of geographies. They're very picky with where they do their redirection attacks. The elites who can do it see added success in their fraud. However, we do see what they're doing. They're not able to completely evade security with this, and we do know already how to deal with them. And although they keep changing the scheme, we keep following it and educating our customers, the banks, with you guys and collaborate, which brings me to the last part of my presentation. So, in order to stop cybercrime, this is being said a lot, and this I think needs to always be reiterated, especially in times where we're all in one room together, is that we need to collaborate and share information. And what IBM has been doing to that effect is we just took 700 terabytes of IOC and threat data and IP reputation and whatever you would probably need in terms of information about threats and threw it into a platform that's free to access called X-Force Exchange, where you can get real-time information about threats. You can share information, you don't have to, but you can get free information from those who do share it, which is our customers and ourselves. We do it, as close to real-time as possible. So as soon as we find IOCs, as soon as we find information about threats, you'll probably see it already in the X-Force by simple keyword search. So it's kind of Google for threats, and it would look something like that. And it's very easy to join. Again, it's free, so I really invite you guys to take a look at it. If you have any questions, I'm here now, and there's going to be a break right after my session, so I'm going to be around and you can ask.
Where money is. You also said that it's also very complex and it's not for everyday regular criminals. It's not a task that's easy for them to do. Do you see future transition into using more ransomware because it's easy, it's more automatic, criminals and not high-end criminals to use?
Yeah, I think that ransomware, I call it the lazy criminals work, because they just infect people and wait for the money to get to them. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing gangs also that see value in doing ransomware. So the crypto wall, crypto locker, there are in that sphere different types of actors. And we definitely see a crazy hike in ransomware. There's no doubt about it. However, we also see at the same time that fact that cybercrime per se is becoming more sophisticated and more the domain of gangs.